change detection is the part of Angular which synchronizes the state of our components, component tree, with the DOM. You can also say it updates the DOM. Now, I've already made a video about change detection last year, and this was at the time when Angular 17 was out. Now in Angular 18, something very important happened, namely the zoneless change detection. And that was such an important change that I thought maybe it's a good idea to come up with an updated, with a modernized version of this video. So in this video, I want to explain, first of all, what change detection is all about, how it works, and then the different modes. So OnPush, the change detection strategy, the local change detection, then zoneless, the hybrid mode. And I also want to give an outlook on what we can expect for the future, at least what we know currently. And by saying that, welcome to this video. My name is Rainer Hanekamp. I'm part of Angular Architects. We provide workshops, consulting, training in Angular. And I would say now let's start. So we start with a little bit of a theory. The way how Angular updates the DOM, the process is the change detection. And the way how it works is that Angular always sees here two sides. On the one side, we have our component tree. So these are the classes with the template and the TypeScript class, obviously. And there we have certain properties representing values, or we can also call methods from the template, which are then returning those values. On the right side, we have the DOM. Now, Angular knows exactly what kind of values are shown in the DOM and what values our current component has. So it starts at the very top at the app component, and it checks if the values in the class are still the same as they are in the DOM. And then it continues to do this. So as we see here, we have here a change in one of the lower components, but it still starts with the app component at the very top. It checks it, says, yeah, wonderful, no change there. Why do I have to change there anything? And then it continues, checks the other components, and then it hits finally the one that there is a change and says, oh, okay, I need to fix it. I need to update now the DOM as well. So if the value is 2, then now the DOM also gets the value 2. Then Angular says, okay, wonderful, done. This has been checked and then also fixed. And it continues to do this until no components are left. That's the way how the change detection works. Now the question is, who's starting them? Or does the change detection always run in an interval of a second or so? No, there are some triggers for the change detection. So it's not running automatically in an interval. There is something which is the zone.js. This is a library, this is called zone.js. In zone.js, you can kind of say it's monitoring what you're doing, what kind of tasks are running. And Zone.js listens to DOM events, but they need to be handled DOM event. So you need to have an event listener, a method in your component with a click event, for example, that listens to it. If you just have a button and your users are clicking on a button, then this is not handled. There needs to be really a method for it. And once such a method happens, once such a DOM event, a handled DOM event happens, then the Zone.js is aware of it, and then it starts to trigger the change detection. The same is also true for the asynchronous task. Also the knowledge about asynchronous tasks, what kind of asynchronous tasks are currently scheduled, when do they end, this is then also done by Zone.js. And then Zone.js says, okay, if now an asynchronous task has ended, then there is a chance that somewhere a component has changed one of its values, and I need to rerun the change detection, and I need to search if there was a change actually. And in a way that makes sense, because we have to know about, when you think about it, you have to say, okay, what kind of events or what criteria could there be in an application where something changes in a component? Well, only if our users are doing something, so I click on a button or type something into an input field, obviously, yes. But also, for example, if I now click on a button and I'm starting an asynchronous task, and the asynchronous tasks ends, well, then probably that one returns a certain result, which also then changes some of the components, and then the change action also needs to run. And these are the only two places where a change could happen. If you manage to make a change outside of these two things, of these two criteria, then probably change action will not be executed automatically. If you have found some cases, I would be very interested. I just found one case once, but this was a rarity. It doesn't happen that often. Good. So zone.js, change it action. Change it action, the process, zone.js, the trigger. They play together. If we now look at this change it action process, about the things which are good, then I would say what really shines is the DOM manipulation, because this is always the most expensive task. So whenever you go to the DOM and you want to do some changes there, that's really expensive. Adding two numbers doesn't cost anything. And therefore, when it comes to change, when it comes to DOM manipulation, a framework has to be really efficient. And Angular is actually perfect for it. Because what Angular is doing is that it says, okay, I know exactly the position where the change has happened, and I'm only changing that particular part. It even goes so far that Angular says, well, if there is just a text that was changed, then I can leave the DOM element as it is, not speaking of the component, just the DOM element like a p tag, and I'm just replacing the text inside of it. So that's almost, you cannot be more efficient than that already. And this is what I always think is not so nice, because I very often read articles on Medium and so where people say, yo, Angular, it's not very performant because whenever you do a change, it re-renders the complete component. No, what it does, it runs the change action, but it only accesses the DOM if it's absolutely necessary. So this is really something that you need to remember. By the way, you can also see this in testing. If you have a test, you usually can select a component, DOM element, and then you have the DOM element into a variable. Then you change maybe just some text. So you say property, the text now has to change to a new value. You run the change it action, then you will see that the DOM element is still the old one, because Angular did not replace it. So, is it now perfect? No, there are some things that we have to consider. The two main, let's say, weaknesses of the Zone.js change it action interplay are, first of all, that the change it action doesn't really know where to look or where a change has happened. So it could be the case, as we have seen before, that at the very lowest component in our tree, a change happened, but still change it action needs to start at the very top and it has to go through. In the worst case, it could be that I have, for example, a button, I click on it, then I have a handle DOM event, and then my method is just saying console log, hello, or you have clicked me, or something like this. So something where there is no update for the DOM necessary. And in these cases, unfortunately, change it action also runs, because it doesn't know if there is a change. It just has a suspicion. It got the advice from Zone.js. There is a probability that something has changed. You might want to check. That's also why it's called change detection. We need to detect if there was a change. The other thing is, and this is not the other thing, but this is the one that I have already mentioned, it runs too often. So it runs also in those cases when there was no change at all. So, and now there are various improvements on how we can make it a little bit better. I guess the one that always comes up is the OnPush change detection strategy. And what this is all about is that we say we want to fix it a little bit, we want to improve the situation with changes have to be found. So we want to limit the scope of the search or of the components that the change detection has to go over. What OnPush is saying is that you can mark now certain components with OnPush, and OnPush then kind of says to the change detection, hey, look, You don't need to check this particular component unless I am telling you to do that. So there isn't a certain marker that says I'm now opening up this component so the change detection can go into it and check for a change. We don't say we open it up, but we say the component is marked as dirty. That's the jargon, or that's the terminology that you usually will hear very often. So we see now in the same illustration we had before that there is now a certain component, there is a lock. And this is how you need to imagine it. This component has change detection set to OnPush, and it's locked by default. And if the change detection now runs, it goes over all the components. It sees, oh, there is an OnPush component. It is not marked as dirty. That's why I just skip it, ignore it, and I will continue with the other components if there are some. The obvious question is, when does an OnPush component gets marked as dirty? And this is very important. There are some criteria. Immutable property binding. So if this component has an input and the value changes, then it has to be a completely new object reference. I will show later what I mean. Handled DOM events. If your component, again, has an event listener, I click on the button inside of the OnPush component, then this event will not just be kind of catched by zone.js in order to trigger the change detection. It will also mark that particular component as dirty. So those kind of handled DOM events are doing two things at once. You can also run manually mark for check. This is something that especially libraries are doing. You can use the async pipe, then someone else, namely the async pipe, is running mark for check for you. And you can also have a signal in your component. And then if you change the signal, then it is also automatically marked as dirty. Yeah, so far for the theory. And now let's kind of explore this with the real application. So we have here our application. I go to holidays, then I click here on this quiz. And this is the one that we will now use for the rest of the video. What do we see here? We see here, first of all, a last rendering. So this is kind of updated every second, which kind of means that it's really kind of the DOM update happens every second. And then we have here a normal quiz. Yeah. So I can click on certain answers, and then the quiz is telling me if it's right or not. I can also reset the quiz if I want to. So first things first, when it comes to change detection, you want to use the DevTools of this is an extension for your browser. The DevTools, the Angular extension has here also a profiler. And if you click on the profiler, then it will show you how often the change detection runs. And you see here quite often, every second, which obviously is not a big surprise because we see here also that this last rendering is also updated every second. Good. So we could say, okay, now it makes sense what we see here. It's not a surprise. But we want to know why. Why is this happening? Why is the change detection running so often? That's not very performant here because I'm not doing anything and it still runs. Let's go back to our application. So we have here our quiz component. This is the way how it looks like. So we have here a lot of HTML. And here at the very top, we have here last rendering. And you see it's calling a function and then it formats it. Yep. It's calling a function. The function or the method here is returning the new date. Now, I'm not doing this for the first time. I'm not showing this example for the first time. And always, what participants say then, well, that's the problem. Right here, you have it right in front of you. The problem is you are calling a method, a function, inside of a template. We know that we are not allowed to do this except we are using signals. It's a different story, but don't call functions. Yeah, well, if it's the function, then let me quickly comment it out. Also go here to the template. Here we are. Last rendering is then also commented. I go back to my application. Now we see we don't see here anything. And then I click on the profiler again. No, it's still running every second. So that means that my function call didn't have anything to do with the change detection here. It was not the trigger. And that's also true, by the way. You can call functions in a component. You just need to be aware that whenever the change detection runs, that this function is then also executed, but that doesn't mean that the function triggers the change detection. There's a difference between these two things. Yeah, so in our case, we have something else. And as I said before, there are only two triggers for that. It could be a handled DOM event, or it is an asynchronous task. Well, since I don't click on anything and the change detection is still running, in the meantime I have clicked on stop again, it needs to be an asynchronous task. There is just no other way, almost. At least not in my application. And the point here is there is an asynchronous task running. If I click here on app quiz status, then we see here something that there used to be something like a countdown, which was deactivated, but I forgot to deactivate the code, which is running in the constructor. And here we have it. We have an interval which runs every second, and that's the problem. That's the root. This is the one which is triggering the change detection all the time. Which means, if I'm correct, and this function from before is not the trigger, then I can comment out the interval. I can now go back to my quiz component and I say, you know what? This last rendering, we use it again because I want to see that it's not triggering the change detection. And that means that the last rendering is not updated every second anymore. It just stays until I trigger the change detection with some other criteria. So I go back. Here we see it is stable. Last rendering is already some time ago. And now I click on a certain answer and then it updates itself. Of course, we can also take a look at the profiler. So I click here on run. And we see that nothing happens except I click again on an answer like this. But then it runs just only once. Okay? So this is the basics that you need to know about the change detection, the triggers. With Zone.js. Yeah, so this is still what we have here. So we have an application where we have Zone.js running, and Zone.js at the moment is the trigger for it. All right, so now let me quickly reinstantiate the status that we had before. So I want to have here this interval in this case. I really want that my users see the countdown. That's actually necessary. So if I now reload it, we know now that the change detection runs every second, and this is expected. So it could now be that you have heard, you just enable OnPush and then everything will work as expected. So now we can do that. So you say, okay, without knowing the details, I say here, change detection, and I'm activating here the OnPush, and I'm doing this in this quiz status component, the subcomponent, the UI component of my complete quiz component. Well, what will happen now? Something which I actually don't want, because now this time left here is not updated anymore, but the last rendering is updated all the time. And that also means that the change detection is now running every second, but maybe I don't need the last rendering here because it doesn't have any use, but still I have now a running change detection. My users don't see anything. So they don't see the impact of the change detection because this one here is not updated. So why it's not updated? Well, because I have made one of the two major errors that you can do when you have change detection set to OnPush. And please, this is important, because I think this is really that the main two errors are if you have asynchronous task in an OnPush and you don't handle it correctly. And the second is if property binding doesn't happen immutably. Here we have the first error source of error. It's the asynchronous tasks. It's nothing wrong about asynchronous tasks, but they are not handled correctly. Problem is, I'm just assigning a value to a property. This is not a trigger, or this is not something that marks a component as dirty. We have seen this before in the slides. What marks a component as dirty? And in this case, we have two options. We can say the first one, and there is also another option where we say the interval is coming from the parent component. But we're not doing it now. But we can use here an observable or a signal for this time left property. If we use an observable, then we have to make sure that the time left is not again resubscribed, but that we use the async pipe in the template, because only the async pipe is doing the dirty marking. And the other one is then obviously the signal. So what do I have to do? Well, I say here just, okay, the time left is actually now an observable. And this is an observable, again, which is coming from an interval like this. It's not 180, but let's say here, take until destroyed, that's fine. And instead of using here a subscribe, I say I have a map method. In this map, I just say, okay, the same function that we had here. So I'm going to copy this like this. This is then also returned. Then I can let go of the subscription, and here we just comment the things out. This one as well. Good, then I have my time left. I need to go to my template here, and then I just say here, if, let's say time left, we are using now the async pipe, we say, no, as time left, and then I'll put it into this as well. So async pipe is hopefully, no, is not, needs to be imported here as well. Where are my imports? Async pipe. And now I can go back, and we see now the time is again updated. Wonderful. This is exactly what I wanted. So this was the way with the observable. Again, just make sure you use the async, then you're fine. And then the other way is then by using the signal. So I would say here, the time left is not an observable, but the time left is a signal. So we start with 180. And then we can have here an interval if we want to. That is fine. Also with a subscription, we are now updating here the value of the signal. This is important. And now if we go here to the top, then I can say here, time left, time left, time left. I call it, I save it, I go back, and now it's again working as expected. Okay? So signal, as you see, it's a little bit easier, but observable also works. The other option would have been that maybe you say, it's not really user-friendly, but just showing that it is possible, it would be possible that you say, okay, you want to set there a button where you say update the countdown. That is also an option. Then we would trigger the change detection via a handled DOM event. Yeah, so I would say here, okay, look, we have here time left, and I could say here we have a button which says update time left. We have then the mat raised button. Yeah. And if I click on it, and this is now the interesting thing, handle update, I just need to have a method with that name, and I don't need to do anything, but this one will now mark this component as dirty and at the same time also trigger the change detection. Yeah. So yeah, maybe I should also replace it again, not using here the signal. So time left is now again a property, otherwise it does not make that much sense. And I say here equals, and then also remove this part. Wonderful. And here again, like this. And now if I go back, the countdown stops. Again, this doesn't mean that the time left was not updated, but now I just click on it, and then we see now with every click, the mark for check happens, and dirty marking happens, and it's also updated. But again, if there is no click event there, yeah, then I can click on it as often as I want. It still triggers a DOM event, but Angular says, no, this is not a handled DOM event. You're not listening to it. So why do you think that I should run the change detection? You didn't change anything. So also keep this in mind. It needs to be a handled DOM event. And if we are already kind of going through all the list of the different options, let me remove the button here again. Then we can also say the last one, which I don't really find a nice one, but that we say, okay, we are using with the change detect ref. So I could say here I have CDR, inject, change detect ref. And then I can still do a property update after this one here. And then you say here, this CDR, and you're doing the dirty marking manually. And you see here, it's not called the dirty marking, but it's in this case, it's called the mark for check. Yeah, right. And now it is also running. It is also running. Good. Some of you might not use mark for check, but detect changes. Don't do this. Because what detect changes is doing, let me quickly show you. I mean, you could say it's kind of working. Looks exactly as it looked before. But there is one thing. If I go now to my quiz component and I say my parent component now also has the change detection strategy set to OnPush. OnPush. Then we see that time left is updated, but the last rendering not. Why that? Because detect changes triggers the change detection on that particular component, and of course also then to its subcomponents, and it does it immediately, synchronously. Usually change detection is scheduled asynchronously, but if you have a detect changes, it really runs synchronously only for that component. And that's why we usually say don't do this, don't run detect changes, use the mark for check, because it's very likely that something else, like an asynchronous task, is triggering the change detection, and then you're marking the component as dirty, but the change detection execution happens because of the asynchronous task that runs in our case here with this interval. But keep this in mind. This is something that I still want to have at the end, because I don't want that my parent component, the quiz component, is updated when the time left changes. I want to actually have it exactly as it is right now, but maybe not with detect changes. And by the way, and I hope by now this is clear, if I would run here, if I would click here again on a button, then the time here would also be updated, obviously. Yeah, and by looking at the time, we need to hurry up because it's now very soon bedtime. Good. Before we now come to the so-called local change detection, there is something else I wanted to show you, namely the other main source of error where OnPush does not work as it should be, and that's mutable changes for property binding. So what I've changed now is that my time started, that one here, has now become an object literal. So it's now a value which contains new date. Before it was a signal. Also in my quiz status component, we have here the update. So we're saying here time started value, and then we see here obviously the current date. Yeah, here also the property binding. And this is, as I said now, the second main error source when you are using OnPush. You need to make sure when you have a change to a property binding, in this case time started, that the change happens immutably. So I need to recreate a complete new object reference. Currently, if I click on reset, as we see, this is not going to happen. The time started object reference stays the same. I'm doing the change of value in place. Dangerous. So if I go back and if I click then here on reset, then we see the time does not change itself. Unless I say, okay, we have here value, and then I click on it. So, sorry, reassigning it here, like this. And if I would now say I'm going to reset the time, then we see it's going to get updated. Yeah. If the OnPush would not be there, then it's not a problem. Then I could also do it in place. But of course, then other lifecycle hooks like the on changes would not work. And in general, I would say this kind of error source will go away in the future, because we will use more and more signals. And with signals, we have already the update method and the set method, which demand immutable updates, because a lot of other things would then also not work. Not just the change detection, for example, computed would not also pick up the changes. So again, two main error sources: asynchronous tasks which are not handled properly, and then also mutable changes to property binding. And we have now also seen how we can deal with them, what options we have available. So I mentioned before that the OnPush change detection strategy is something where we can limit the amount of components that have to be checked. There is something I didn't tell you before. If you have a large, deep component tree and the change happens in very, very deep, then the child component marks all its parent components also as dirty. Now the obvious improvement here would be that we kind of make of a hybrid mix, where the child component, that one that has the actual change, says I was changed, you need to check me, but you don't need to check my parents, so I will give them a certain marking where the change detection knows I don't need to check the parents, but I need to go into them, I need to search for the child that was marked as dirty. And this is what we call the local change detection. And that is, I would say, very hard to achieve, at least at the moment. First of all, the component and all its parents need to be marked as, not need to be marked, they need to have the OnPush strategy. Then a change needs to happen via a signal. This is important. Only a change to a signal is able to do the local change detection. But that's not all of it. You also need to make sure that this change does not mark the component as dirty, that the event of the change does not mark the component as dirty. Now we have two possible events. We have the DOM events, the handled DOM events, and the asynchronous task. And if there is a handled DOM event, then we know that the handled DOM event is already marking this component also as dirty, but also not the child component here, but also its parent components as well. So the only thing that could do this is a change to a signal via an asynchronous task. Yeah, because then the asynchronous task will not mark the component as dirty. But then if you have that, and if your component then has a certain change, it kind of opens itself up, it unlocks itself, and it tells the change detection, hey look, somewhere down below there is a component that you need to check, but you can ignore all its parents. And this is something which we can also do now. Yeah. So, well, first of all, we need to go now to our quiz component. That's the parent component. And we have to say here, change detection on push. First step. Second step, I need to go to my quiz status component. And now I need to make sure that the change here happens to the signal. So again, I have here my interval where I say, okay, here is my time left set. I'm doing the change here, and then I'm activating here my signals in that template. What does this mean? This means now that only the quiz status, because the change to the signal happens via an asynchronous task. Now only the quiz status gets checked, but not its parent, because that's also its OnPush. And now we see it. We now see the countdown is running, but not the last rendering. And if I now click here on an answer, then of course the last rendering is now updated because now the quiz component was updated, but not because my time left has marked the parent component also as 30. So this is local change detection, what we see here, without using this manual detect for changes, which kind of produced the same result before. And now finally, we've reached Angular 18. Now in Angular 18, there was a big change, as I mentioned in the introduction, and it is dealing with this issue of the change detection runs too often. It also runs in those places where there was no change at all. What Angular 18 did is that they said, we are now going to introduce a third trigger or a second trigger, if you count zone as just one, and the third trigger will be mark for check. So every time until now, all these criteria that you have seen before, that doing a dirty marking, all those are executing mark for check. And they are now also executing or triggering the change detection. And this is what we have now by default since 19 or since 18, but also 19. You have zone.js running, but on the same time also mark for check is triggering the change detection. So it's not triggered multiple times, but it only runs, of course, once. The possibility, though, with mark for check being a trigger as well, means now that we can actually remove zone.js. So, coming back to this illustration we had before, I could now say, well, component tree, DOM, I just eliminate zone.js, I just remove it. A change happens somewhere in my component. And now the question is this a change which would trigger this thing as mark for check, which would do the dirty marking? And by now we know what kind of events are doing this. And then mark for check says, okay, I am now triggering myself the change detection. And then it's as it was done, as it was already before. Change detection goes through, starts at the very top and goes through. Unless we did some local change detection on push, etc. And this is something I can show. So I go now back to my application. And let's say we have now a situation where we say we don't want to update our countdown every second, but maybe, we can do the update here whenever we are running here. So we see here console log countdown is running, but let's say we are not updating the signal all the time. So what I actually want to do is that I say here new time left. Yeah, so I'm removing this and this. And then I say, you know what? Only after 5 seconds, I want to update my time left. So I say here, time left, set new time left, like this. Okay. So now I go back to my application. And we see now the update now really happens of time left, now really happens every 5 seconds. What does this mean for the change detection? How often is that one executed? Well, let's go to the profiler. Every second again. That's the problem. Change detection runs too often. It runs 5 times too often. And now we can say, hey, look, the change detection runs because an asynchronous task sends. That's a trigger coming from the zone.js. Let's just remove the complete zone thing and only say, well, the signal, once it gets changed, is also doing the mark for check internally. And if it runs, then also the change detection, then we are fine. Change detection only runs every 5 seconds. What do I have to do? I need to go, first of all, I need to go into my app config. And there at the very top, I have to say, provide experimental zoneless change detection. You see, it is experimental. It's not developer preview, it is experimental. Should you use it? Not if you not necessarily require it, because it's experimental. What you also should do is that you should go to your Angular JSON. You look for the zone.js. It's here in the polyfills. There is also one in for the testing task. Yeah, you remove it, and then we are restarting Angular again. And then we will see if, first of all, if our application is still working, and if there is now a difference, if there is now a more efficient change detection process. So, has it been reloaded? No. Does it update itself every 5 seconds? Yes, it does. What does it do with the change detection? But it runs only every 5 seconds. So we could not say, wonderful, we are done. Maybe we are mistrusting the whole thing. Maybe we say, okay, how can we be sure? Well, if you remember, in the quiz status component, I left here a console log, countdown is running. So we should see this now every second showing up in our console. Which is the case. Okay. So we have now asynchronous tasks which are really running, but it doesn't matter because an asynchronous task running will not trigger the change detection anymore. Only the mark for check. Now if you say wonderful, but if we have a large application, can I be sure that there is not somewhere a change which is not kind of detected and where the change detection is not running? Then I have something for you, because there exists something, and this is for that I have to go back to my app config, and there I have to say I want to provide something else. I want to provide the check no changes for debug. Unnecessarily, I don't have to say it's experimental as you see here. And what I can do here is that I say I want to have an interval, and I want to have an interval of 1000. What this interval will do is that it will tell me if in one of my components a property has changed its value, but it was not picked up by the change detection. So I'm getting then a warning. So if I now go back, we see, actually everything is working as it should. So we are not getting here any warnings. But if I would now go to my quiz status component, and I would say I have here somewhere a native time left, or let's call it the raw time left, which is not a signal, it's just a simple property, because we don't want to trigger the change detection. Then I can say here, okay, we are starting here with 0. And if I now go back, and I say here next to the console running, I want to update my raw time left every time. Not just every 5 seconds, but every time. Let's see what this now means for our additional changes. Yeah, we're getting now the known error message, because now this kind of process has seen, oops, there was a change in the component, in the template, which didn't trigger the change detection. That's why I'm letting it fail. If I would remove it, if I would say no, I don't want to run with this additional change, then it's working, but unfortunately I'm not aware that my application is not really stable in that sense that every change is then being rendered. And now the last thing, which is the outlook for the future. There will be signal components. Signal components will be very special. The funny thing is, signal components were already planned for Angular 17, but they didn't make it. And we always kind of believed, and I think it was the same also for the Angular team, that only signals are the key for zoneless applications. And then they realized, hey, wait, we can also use zoneless without signals, as long as mark for check is used. So we could use only observables and use the async pipe. Then you can also go with zoneless. That's also a possibility. So signals, zoneless does not really require signals. And then signals components got a little bit delayed. But what can we expect? It says here change detection on a view level. That means that A component usually contains smaller parts, and we call them few. So if you have an if, for example, then this region kind of itself is a few, and you can then have multiple fews in a template. Now, with single components, the change detection could operate only on a few levels. So it doesn't have to check the complete component, but only the few. It will also have this OnPush behavior. I mean, if we have to use signals, then that's not an issue. As we know, signals work very good with OnPush. It will not have zone.js, obviously. And this fine-grained change detection, I explained that one before. And the rest is then speculation. Structural directives, probably they will not work. Yeah, at least this was one of the argumentation when Angular brought out the new control flow for ngIf, ngFor, and ngSwitch, where they said they were not ready for single components. So we kind of thought, do we make them ready for single components, or do we want to replace an ngIf with a control flow if? And this is then also what happened at the end. And then we also have, and I think that's quite sure to say, that single components should be standalone and should not depend on an ng module. As I know the Angular team, they really try to make always the best for everyone. So if it also works with an ng module, if it's technically possible that a single component could also be an ng module based component, I guess they will make it. But I hope not, that at least we have one further reason why everybody wants to go to standalone. So this is what we can expect for the single components. Again, some parts of here are speculations or can also change over time. And we see here the fine-grained version. So the signal changes only a part, the few in this component, and then the change detection also only runs in this particular few of the component and ignores the rest. Last thing, change detection is complicated, but you can make it very easy for yourself. You will be able to disable zone.js to go with Zoneless, and you have the best developer experience if you just use signals. Then you don't need to know about the mark for check. Signals will do everything for you. So we have now reached the end. And there is something which I probably should have said in the very beginning in the introduction of this video. I have a very special relationship when it comes to change detection and the necessity to know about it. I think that it is not a must-have skill of someone who is a beginner in Angular. I would even say also a little bit advanced Angular developer, that they have to know about all these details about change detection. Why? The why is important, because usually if everything runs by default, then in the past zone.js has taken over. We just had to make sure that we're changing the values of our properties, and then zone.js did the rest for us. Now in the future, I would say just go with signals. Use signals, then you don't need to care about anything else in terms of change detection. It will just work. Again, I know that there are a lot of other people who have a completely different opinion, but at least I wanted to share my personal opinion in this video. Where you definitely need to know about change detection is obviously if your application is struggling with performance issues. Then yes, of course, then why not? Then you need to know about change detection. Another place is also when you're working on UI libraries. Then you also need to know how to make them as performant as much as possible, because you never know who's going to use that library, in which kind of context, setting these libraries are running, on what hardware it is going to be used. So there you really have to make sure that your UI components are very, very performant. And that's it. So again, if there are some questions, if you have any feedback, then as always, please leave it below in the comments. You can also share your own opinion about at what level is it necessary to know about change detection. And I would be happy if you subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it already. Also happy about a like. And I would say thanks again for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.